Hello and welcome to the Monster Mechanics Podcast, where we take creatures of myth and media and see how they can be improved. I am your host, Scott Paladin, and with me as always is the Jeeves to my Wooster, Zach Jaquays. What are we talking about today, Zach?
Today we are talking about Bigfoots. Big feet?
Big feets.
There we go.
So, Bigfoot is probably America's most famous cryptid. Cryptids being creatures that people think might actually exist, but that haven't been proven yet. I think they're most commonly associated with the Pacific Northwest, where they are described as very large, humanoid, hairy people that seem to walk through the woods and not do a whole lot else. So evidence for them includes things like people find really big footprints in the woods, and sometimes they find fur and scat in the woods, and they say, oh, this must be from a Bigfoot. And then there have been a couple of very famous film and video shots of Bigfoots walking through the woods. It seems to be all they do is kind of just wander around the woods.
Gotta get that cardio in.
Got to get that cardio in. And the thing is, in America, they're called Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Is I think I think that might be a native term. Oh God, I should have looked this up. I probably just said something a little bit off. But there are lots of other cultures out there that have a similar sort of, oh, there's a big dude living in the woods. He's covered in fur. The Yeti of the Himalayas are like this. I think there's a South American legend that's very similar. There's actually a theory that these are a sort of holdover legend. Like this is something that was passed down because there actually were large humanoids at one point back in our prehistory. And when I say prehistory, I mean a long time ago. Like we were not Homo sapiens at the time. We were talking about like Australopithecines. There were a couple of hominids that were quite a bit larger than us. And so there's a theory running around that like this is a holdover kind of memory, cultural memory of when there actually were. Yeah. Giants get kind of explained the same way. Now, whether or not any of that holds up, or if I think the much more likely scenario is that people are creative and that they see something in the woods and they go, ooh, that looks like a giant dude. And they start telling stories about it.
They see a bear with mange or something.
Yeah. Almost, there's a joke among some of these things where like almost anytime anybody thinks it's a Bigfoot, it's some sort of bear. Like they'll find hair and they'll be like, oh, this is Bigfoot hair. And you get it tested and it's bear hair. And you see some giant poop in the wood and you're like, oh, that's Bigfoot poop. And it's bear, it's bear poop. Or, you know, like, so like at that point, everything is bears, you know, like what's that knock in the woods? Oh, it's bears.
What's that Bigfoot? 3 bears in a trench coat.
Yeah, exactly. Who killed JFK? Oh, it was bears, you know. But I think that is a ripe area for us to do a little bit of fun with. I have a pitch for you. I think we're just going to use that as a jumping off point to give you a little bit more biology. Have you heard of the axolotl?
I am familiar.
Yes. If our listeners are not, axolotls are a Mexican newt that stays in its larval phase. Newts normally start off as aquatic, and then at some point during it, they become terrestrial, sort of like frogs. Axolotls stayed what we call neotenous, which is to say they stayed in their younger form. And they were discovered in the 18th century in Mexico. And famously, although whether or not this is a completely true story or not, some of them were sent back to England in a crate. And when they arrived, they were adult newts, which nobody had ever seen before. And the theory is that if you give them the right conditions, axolotls can grow into an adult form that they don't do in the normal natural course of things. It turns out that you can actually, they tend to force this now. You can still do it, although I don't recommend it, by injecting them with iodine. Seems to be the answer for it. So it's more like a chemical or hormonal change that seems to cause it rather than like outside stimuli. But that would all make sense. So the story goes that Julian Huxley, a naturalist at the time, repeated this experiment and confirmed it, and that his brother, Aldous Huxley, wrote a story about it. Except in this version, a human lives to be about 200 years old and grows into an ape. And the logic behind that is that humans display a lot of neotenous traits. For example, we have a lot less hair. We have a lot larger heads, which is something you see in neotenous creatures. Our teeth and jaws are underdeveloped for an ape because we tend to eat cooked food mostly. And so they're sort of floating out there the idea that there is an adult form of humanity that exists that we don't see anymore, that we all stay in sort of our preteen baby states before we grow all of the hair that we actually should have. So, and my theory is that's what Bigfoots are. Bigfoots are the newt version of our axolotl. They are the adult stage of humanity that we never actually reach under normal circumstances.
That's a really cool idea. I like the idea of there being a puberty 2.0.
Precisely. And so I don't know what the circumstances would be that would turn a human into a Bigfoot. Maybe it's something about like a hormonal change, like we were talking about. Like maybe if you get the wrong amount of some sort of chemical into your system, or maybe it has to do with circadian rhythms or exposure to temperature changes in a certain scenario or something like that. I don't know what that circumstance would be, but that it triggers a physiological change. Again, like puberty 2.0 is a great way to describe it, where we undergo all these changes and then we get bigger and hairier. And then with it, it would seem to me that it comes along with some sort of mental change as well, where like, Bigfoots don't go back to their day job and like continue to go to school and college and things. They wander off into the woods and don't seem to want to talk to people anymore. And so what does it mean to be a Bigfoot?
I like the idea that maybe this can be like all those missing people reports that are never actually explained. They're just, this person just went off and Bigfooted.
Yeah. So in that case, maybe it's something that's likely to happen while you're in the woods. Because a lot of missing persons are people who are, out and about. And so something that about being exposed to nature, that would make a sort of sense. Oh, I like this.
Okay.
Solitude. We are, as humans are very, very social creatures. We spend a lot of time interacting with and talking to and like being with other people. And maybe this is one of those things where the life cycle could have been that at some point we stop being social creatures and we start to go off on our own. And that's what starts to trigger that physiological change, is when you're expelled from your sort of your group of siblings or whatever it was that you grew up with. And so by being out and alone and absolutely isolated from other humans for long enough, that it starts to trigger your Bigfoot change.
Interesting. That's really cool. And like that also explains why it's never really a documented case. Because if there's someone there, like I like the idea that maybe like even if you're being observed.
Yes.
You can't trigger.
Yeah. It could also be one of those things where if you think about like if you think that you are being in contact with people, you could trick yourself into preventing it as well by just like reading books, for example, as a way to talk to other people. Like you are reading their words in your head, or like seeing media, or even just seeing pictures of people. All of these things are enough to keep off that change. And I love the idea that even if as long as you're observed, even like something about there are quantum experiments that seem to have an observer bias that as long as somebody's actually paying attention to them, that changes the outcome. And this could be one of those. Like there's something about the very act of it being observed that prevents it from happening. Literally a watched human, never Bigfoots. Hey, man, you proposed the idea. I just took it to its natural conclusion.
Thanks. I hate it. Well, that's a really cool idea. I like because that also explains like why you don't have humans like in isolation, like imposed isolation.
Yeah,
like it doesn't happen to them.
Yes,
you don't have Bigfoot suddenly wandering out of solitary.
Yes. And it's also one of those things where you have all these things that can prevent it. So like even if you went on a meditation retreat and didn't talk to anyone for a year or two, but like you're reading texts or you're seeing pictures of your loved ones, or even seeing like statues, representations of people, like it reminds you of humanity. So it requires like absolute aloneness. Like you have to be completely cut off from society and from other people. And that has to happen for a long enough period of time for these changes to start induce. And then once they become induced within you and you start to become a Bigfoot, you lose that like part of your brain that wants to seek out other people. And so it becomes self-reinforcing. And then you might just disappear. Like, nobody ever sees you again because you stop caring and you just head off into the wilderness on your own. And if you are covered in fur and a lot bigger and stronger and hardier than a normal human would be, you like don't even need to like make a cabin or like a structure or anything. You just kind of like a deer, you just go off into the wilderness and survive on your own.
Yeah, I like that.
That's pretty cool.
So let's talk about like what the big feats actually are.
Okay, so you mean like what's their physiology or?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about all the quote unquote documented cases of Bigfoot sightings is they're always very blurry.
I have a hard time coming up with a logical reason for why they'd always be blurry, short of like magical or psionic powers or something like that. Like they have a telepathic, unobservant, like a. Actually, well, I don't know. We were talking about how to induce the change, it requires like them not to be observed. And maybe that there's something about that that's self-reinforcing. Like once they aren't observed for a while, they don't want to be observed. And maybe that gives them some ability to obscure themselves, like to sort of like I'm reminded a little bit of the Douglas Adams "Not My Problem" filter.
Refresh my memory.
In the Hitchhiker's Guide series, his version of cloaking devices was the "Not My Problem" filter, which psionically tells people that see it that this is not your problem, and so they just ignore it. And so maybe the Bigfoot has something along those lines where it's like the further down this path they go, the more of a chance that like when you look at it, something about them psionically like makes you think I shouldn't be observing this anymore.
Interesting.
And it like causes you to avert your attention. And so they might actually be a lot more common than people think, but like humans don't observe them because we literally like can't. Like whenever our brains try to process the Bigfoot, it goes nope, not anymore.
It's just like a mental blind spot.
Exactly. That would explain a lot. And so you might have Bigfoots in every national park, and it's just that, and we still occasionally catch glimpses of one because we might see one that's sort of early on its transition or like partway through its transition. It hasn't fully reinforced that psychic blindness quality yet. But that explains why people kind of like don't see most of them.
Yeah, I kind of like that idea. Like I was playing around with the idea of like there being like, I don't know, like some alternate parallel universe that these big feet go to, which is why you only ever see them once and then nobody ever sees them again. Yeah. Something like that. But I really like the idea that there's just kind of like this, like they coexist, but we just ignore their existence because we literally can't process their existence.
Yeah, like there's an observer bias. Like in that way, because they're not interested in humans and we can't perceive them, they kind of do live in a parallel universe where like they live on a parallel Earth where they don't really encounter humans all that often because they don't care and we can't see them. And so they've got this whole other thing living sort of on top of us.
So what if like the big feats that are seen are like they're in their transitionary period. Yeah. Like it's very rare. It's like right after someone has begun their transformation. And it's basically like a not fully formed Bigfoot.
Right. So like the ones that we've seen are like, they're the most humanish, like, and the true adult fully formed Bigfoot is even more so in all of those different directions.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So you could imagine them being like, 9 or 10 feet tall, even like really huge and like absolutely covered in fur, like to the point where they might look a little bit more like, because we kind of imagine apes as having still bald faces, for the most part. Like they still have, but like these guys could be more like Wookiees, where like up to the edges of their eyelids are covered in hair and fur. Yeah. And they might have big claws, like our little fingernails might grow out into these like thick keratinous horn like projections, because it's the keratin in our fingernails is the same material that's in like rhino horn. So you could imagine that like these little nails that we have becoming these huge claws, these really big, like very useful, like bear-like appendages, Yeah,
that's a cool way to look at that. I like the idea of so they clearly don't have like a lot of ecological impact, because otherwise we would have more documentation of like Bigfoot society or something like that. So maybe they're living in caves, or their mannerisms and behavior mimic something like a bear or something. That's
kind of what I was thinking, is that like almost anything that a Bigfoot could do, you could pass off as it being a bear. Like, they're also omnivorous, because we're omnivorous and bears are omnivorous. So they'd be looking for a lot of the same food sources, like, fish and insects, and occasionally hunting down a larger mammal or something like that. But that like, they would never do anything that you would go, oh man, like a bear could not have done this. Although also maybe that explains why everybody thinks that like we're all on a positive or we're positing a alternate reality here. Maybe in that world, bears are actually kind of dumb, and that everybody has like thought, oh, hey, bears are really smart. They get into like cars and all of these like bear-proof trash containers and stuff. And it really turns out that's all Bigfoots. Bigfoots are doing all of that, but that like nobody has a good explanation for who's doing it except bears in this world.
So is there a Bigfoot analog for other animals?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Like we've talked about the axolotl, but like can other animals undergo this transformation?
So the off the top of my head, the next most neotenous animal is dogs. We have bred out a lot of the sort of a wolf-like characteristics in dogs by breeding in them traits that they retain from their childhood form. Things like being a lot more sociable. They don't have as many of the same instincts as wolves do. And they keep like a shorter snout and a larger domed head. So you could imagine like a dog going under the same scenario, turning into a much more like a wolf creature. Maybe keeping some of the breed specifics, but yeah, turning into a wolf basically.
Interesting.
That could be cool. I'm trying to think of other neotenous species.
I'm picturing sort of like almost like this mirror dimension living right alongside
with all of
humanity in the world, where we just refuse to recognize that it exists.
Yeah. Oh, dude, this is completely off topic. Have you ever seen an olm?
What now?
An olm, OLM. So if axolotls are kind of the cute Pokemon version, olm are the like haunted, scary version. Like it's like an axolotl, but like a ghost. I can only way to describe it.
Interesting.
They're like long and skinny and have no eyes because they live in caves. The best picture ever is like the first one off of Google.
Oh yeah, that's freaky.
Yeah, isn't that great? I love. They're my new favorite amphibian, I guess. Although they're not strictly speaking amphibious these days. Yeah, that's the really neoteny. We cause our domesticated animals to exhibit it a lot. Like cows are a lot more like calves than they were like the aurochs, which is what we bred them from. And it's because a lot of the traits we associate as being bad for livestock are really good for survival, like being willing to fight things and having giant, dangerous horns and lots of muscle. And so like you could imagine a lot of our domesticated creatures, if they undergo the same sort of transition, that they would end up being much more like their wild components, much larger, things like that. So maybe you could, oh my God, Paul Bunyan and his big blue ox is he's a Bigfoot and a bull that has undergone the same treatment.
That's amazing. I love it.
Okay, that's cool. So what can we suppose about like the personality of a Bigfoot? Like they're still intelligent like humans would be. Like I can't foresee a world where they become animalistic.
But they're very isolationist.
In fact, it doesn't seem like they'd even be all that interested in other Bigfoots. Like because like the main trait that they're giving up is their socialness. And so they're all kind of off wandering out through the wilderness on their own. But they're still very intelligent. I can almost imagine them being sort of like philosophical. Like they spend a lot of their time like just sitting in quiet thought, thinking deep, like because they have all this time to sort of sit and wander. That would be kind of cool. That if you ever ended up in a scenario where you could have a conversation with one, they might have all these like, they've had all this time to consider like deep truths about the nature of the world and things, and have all this philosophy that they've got tied up inside of their head, but they have no one to talk to pass it on to. So each one kind of starts from its own place and goes off in its own direction.
So what about lifespan of a Bigfoot? I feel like they become basically immortal at that point. Yeah,
that's one way you could go. The other instinct is that larger animals, larger species sometimes get shorter lifespans. Like with dogs we were talking about, like a small dog can live to be 15 or 16 years old, really, pretty easily. And a larger dog like a Mastiff or a Great Dane or something like that, they tend to wear out sooner. So I'm not sure which way sounds better. Like going immortal is cool. Like it makes them these sort of ethereal forest monsters, like gods almost.
Well, what I'm thinking is that if you've got these 9-foot tall humanoid remains, that's gonna leave some evidence of their existence.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. Yeah, we'd be finding them. Yeah, in that case, making them, I love the idea of making them immortal, because it makes them these like otherworldly god-like creatures, you know, like they're off in the wilderness on their own, like barely or never interacting with our society. But they'd have all this knowledge. Like if they have been in a forest for centuries, then they're going to know everything about that forest. They're going to see every season. They're going to have like an almost intuitive understanding of all the animals inside of it. They're going to have observed all of these things, which would make them very, very impressive to watch, because they like hunted down a creature by like knowing which pattern it was going to take down a stream and stuff like that.
I also kind of like the idea that maybe the Bigfoot is responsible for sort of like all like the fairy myths and whatnot of like, you know, leave a saucer of milk out for the fairies or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, the Bigfoot.
Yeah.
And that like any unexplained occurrences in the woods that are usually attributed to fairies instead of the Bigfoot.
You know, they also might be, depending on how their biology works, like how often they need to eat, they could be very sedentary. Like they don't have a lot of motive anymore, especially if mostly what they want to do is sit around alone and think. And so you could actually see them as a little bit like sloths, where like sloths actually stay so still they'll grow moss on them in their fur. And so you could actually see like theoretically you could have a Bigfoot that's big and green. And that was very fairy-like to me. There's also the Green Man myth, which isn't really a myth. It's just like this artistic motif that we saw a ton in European art. It's this green man who's like covered in hair and like leaves and stuff. And it's like, that could be a representation of some people seeing a particularly sedentary moss covered Bigfoot.
Oh, that's cool.
And they thought of it as a god, but you know, it's just a dude who wandered off into the wilderness a few hundred years ago and has been hanging out. I kind of like the idea that, like we were talking about their non-perception filter where like people can't see them. But I kind of would love for there to be some way that they can interact with humans just a little bit, maybe at their own choosing. Like if they happen to be curious about humans, or maybe it's something about their connection to the person in particular. I don't know. Something about like, I would love to get just a little bit of an inroad so that you could have a story where somebody actually interacts with a Bigfoot in their adult state.
Maybe it's I mean, just like this is less to do with the Bigfoot biology, but maybe there's like, you've got some like perhaps you're the protagonist of your story or whatever has suffered some sort of brain damage.
Oh, okay.
Which cancels out that sort of filter or makes them process it differently.
Yeah, that's a great idea. It doesn't even have to be brain damage. It could just be somebody with a neurodivergence. So somebody who has all of these are kind of a little bit stereotypical, but I'm going to rattle them off anyway. Like you could go with somebody who's on an autistic spectrum. You could go for somebody who has like schizophrenia or something like that, where like there's something different about the way they perceive the world and the way their brain works. And so those people might be the most likely to encounter Bigfoots, except they would also be the ones least likely to be believed by those around them, is because they're marginalized by their neurodivergence anyway. You know, you could just make it a rule that like the more neurodivergent you are, the more likely you are to be able to perceive a Bigfoot, but you're also less likely to be, you know, believed.
Maybe you're also more likely to become a Bigfoot because of like
you almost have like, you could almost have 1 foot in that territory anyway, because, you know, people who are neurodivergent sometimes tend to be isolated from society. That's really cool. I like that. So that gives you an inroad for like somebody who would encounter one of these beings and then maybe finding out the truth, start to think about like, well, now I actually have the choice about whether or not I want to become one. Because if you know about how to become a Bigfoot, which is to just go away and be unobserved and to not see humans or not interact with them in any way for a long enough time, you like gain immortality, but you also cut yourself off from society completely. And it's almost like you gain immortality, but also die at the same time. And like what comes out isn't necessarily the same as you.
When afterlife is just being a large hirsute man.
It's all about being a blurry dude in the woods. That's what's really waiting for you. like I would love to see like how the adult Bigfoots would sort of think of humans. Like they're not particularly interested in us, but they know about us. Like they're able to observe us. And sort of their perspective on this whole thing would be very interesting. I'd like having them be kind of really pissed about like global warming, you know, like because they're going to be around for it to be a problem, you know?
Yeah.
That's kind of cool. And like, looking on human things like war and materialism and stuff like that and be like, I don't get that at all. Like you guys you got a lot of crap going on that just doesn't make any sense to me. I'd love to see that story.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a really interesting narrative arc where you've kind of got this ascended human.
Yeah. And it's like not completely above us in a lot of ways, but it is definitely apart from us in a way that's really compelling. Yeah. But at the same time, like was once one of us and sort of knows about all of that.
So we've mentioned that big feet don't really seek each other out.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess with immortality, I guess prolification isn't necessarily their biological drive anymore.
Yeah, it seems like because our stage of life is reproductive, like that next stage wouldn't have to be at all. There's an idea where we've pushed way away from this idea, but there's one from the Ringworld books about the what they call the protector stage of life, which takes this same idea about like humans being neotenous and that there really ought to be like a more adult version of us. And Larry Niven goes a little bit weird with it, where there's a whole like virus that's in a fruit that you have to eat and it turns you into a what he calls a protector, where you get like you lose your genitals and you get a beak. It's weird. Anyway, but the idea,
like you do,
yeah, like you do. But one of the things that he uses that as a way to say like these were the protectors of their tribe. Like they would live through their reproductive stage and then they would go into the second stage, and then their job was to like protect the bloodline. Like they were very much about like, okay, this is my ability to pass on my genes through my children. I am now going to keep this bloodline alive, and I am powerful. They're very strong and very intelligent. And so they spend all of their time like guiding and protecting their relatives. But our version of Bigfoot doesn't seem to do that really. Like they kind of just wander off and do their own thing. So maybe that's not the tack we want to take with them. They're not hugely sociable in our version, but they might still wander across each other and have, you know, maybe hang around for a little bit and long enough to have a conversation or something, or exchange deep philosophical truths or something. I don't know. They, I mean, having them as a, like, maybe at one point in the past, they had sort of a creature that has the ability to like make other creatures ignore it is definitely it seems like it really is a clean break. Like you go off to be a human or go off to be a Bigfoot, and you are really cutting yourself off from humanity in a way that's very definitive, you know, like they don't really have
I like
reason.
that it's kind of if they're kind of focused on maybe like the long-term survival and like that's where all their thinking is focused. I also kind of like the idea that maybe there's kind of this deep despair that they have because in becoming a Bigfoot, like one, they're able to focus more on this problem, but two, they're also able to realize that the problem results from something that they can no longer interact with directly.
All of the things like climate change and, you know, the way we're consuming up the planet and things like that, all these long-term problems, yeah, they would be very clear to somebody who has a lifespan of hundreds of years, and their ability to affect people is very small. So yeah, that's a great catch-22 of them being like, I can see exactly what's wrong, and I could even like tell you how to fix it, but nobody will believe me. And the only people I can talk to are those at the margins of society who have very little effect on society.
Exactly.
That's cool. Yeah, like they're this sharp observer of humanity. That's a very neat role for them. Maybe that was their sort of purpose at one point. Like there's lots of evidence to say that like evolution doesn't have a purpose, and so like creatures don't like have a reason to be, they just kind of are. But like maybe that was the role they fulfilled in society at one point, and like they sat outside of society and observed it and like gave advice to those inside of the society. But so like back when like they really did play the role of like a god or a deity. Like you'd be wandering through the forest and you'd send out your seer, you know, somebody who was a little bit on the they were more likely to have seen a Bigfoot. And so they go out on their own and they find the local Bigfoot and they seek out his advice or her advice. And they come back with what they would interpret to their tribe as like a vision or like a commandment from a god, because that's essentially what it is for them. And that all of this institutional knowledge is passed from the Bigfoots to the humans in that way. And that as our society like became agricultural and then like developed into its own, like with the scientific method and all this other stuff, where like we start to close off ourselves to that other realm of what used to be part of our culture, which, because we stopped trusting these members of our society who could talk to the Bigfoots.
Well, yeah. And like all things, humanity, people saw an opportunity to seize power. Like if you've got, this person on the fringe of society who can see these Bigfoots, and you've got someone who can't, but he wants that power. Yeah. And he's like, well, okay, I went into the woods and I received this vision, and then thus institutionalized religion is born, because he's made up this figure that hands down commandments.
Yeah. And he also, like, by making stuff up, he actually is undermining the authority of the actual Bigfoots and their knowledge that they pass down. But like, he makes stuff up that's self-serving to him, and it also turns out to not to be true or not be useful or whatever. And now everybody like blows off the whole thing because it didn't work that one time.
Exactly.
That's really cool. So it's like this, like the Bigfoots are this whole vestigial part of our species. Like this, they had a purpose. They were supposed to be there, and they never were meant to be directly integrated into our society, because if they were, then their perspective is lost because they get caught up in all the same stuff that we're caught up in. So they're really meant to be a part, but there was supposed to be a channel, and that as our civilization developed, we closed ourselves off to that channel.
We just kind of embraced ignorance and
yeah, exactly. Well, or embraced a different
in favor of power.
Yeah, we embraced a certain kind of knowledge and lost this other kind of knowledge. Yeah. All right. Sorry, my brain broke there for a minute because I realized how far from the original concept we'd gotten. You have that moment where you're walking down a path and you look back at the path that you've been walking down and you're like, holy crap.
I don't live here. Where is this?
Oh crap. We're so far off the path. We're going to become Bigfoots. Yeah. I mean, we've got a fairly complete cosmology for these things now, or complete ecosystem for them. They're not reproductive themselves. They require, it seems like, relatively little resources because they don't have drives and they don't have a lot of impact on the world around them. And they might even spend a lot of time sitting in the woods long enough to become like covered in moss and stuff. But yet people on the fringes of the society, the sort of neurodivergent ones, the ones who people don't normally trust, are the ones who are more likely to be able to perceive them. And that's a channel for information to have flowed from the old ones, the ones who have tons of experience, centuries of experience in this world, and lots of time to observe the humans to pass that knowledge back to them. And now we've broken that cycle. That's really cool.
I like the idea of there also being like maybe a society made up of like this fringe element that also has kind of like they kind of straddle that border between humanity and Bigfootness. Yeah. But they have ambition to like harness the power of Bigfoot somehow. I'm
thinking about what if there's a way, like if you figured out the isolation part of it, and you're like, okay, isolation is how you become a Bigfoot, and there, depending on how you meter out that your contact with humans, that you can extend the transition period longer and longer. That like by careful study as this society of people who have been rejected from the rest of society, and know about this other part of humanity, as they've figured it out, they're able to they go off on their own and they get a little bit down that path of becoming a Bigfoot, and they get some of the qualities, and then they get hit themselves with a dose of seeing other humans, like they come back for a little while, and that slows down the transition period. And then they keep going, you keep moving back and forth between these two worlds. And so they have this very long, drawn out transition from humanity to Bigfoot. And during that time, they have a foot in both worlds. Like they have the ability to go off and talk directly to other Bigfoots and then they can come back and talk to the members of their society who all have some ability to perceive, and because they're all the members of the society are the ones on the fringe and able to perceive them, they don't forget. Like, when somebody wanders off before, they would have been like, oh, that's just a missing person, and they never return. But whereas these people are able to perceive the Bigfoot as he comes back in his later stages and say, oh, hello. And they still recognize it as the same person. And you have this long drawn out transition where they're intentionally becoming a Bigfoot, but also trying to hold on to their connection to that one part of the culture for as long as possible. Oh God, I just see your face.
I'm sorry. Bigfoot edging.
Yeah, I had the thought while I was saying it, and I deliberately didn't say anything. But I'm glad that our minds.
One of us had to.
I'm glad that our minds think in the same way. Yes. Bigfoot edging. Okay. That's it. Bigfoot edging is where we end. We can't come back from that.
I'm sorry, everyone. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that a story where somebody encounters one of these creatures you can write it. Like that's a cool idea. I want to read it. If you do, or if I do it, I want to hear it. Yeah, this is fantastic. This is one of our weird ones that I love. Well, on that note, on the horrible note of Bigfoot edging, let's head out. Bye.
Until next time.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Monster Mechanics. You can find links and show notes at our website, monsterpod.org. Or if you'd like to support us, head on over to patreon.com/monsterpod. We can be found on Twitter at monstermpod, or you can email us at monstermechanicspodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your feedback. Monster Mechanics is produced and edited by Scott Paladin. This episode was hosted by Scott Paladin and Zach Jaquays. All of the ideas produced during this podcast are released under a do what the fuck you want public license.